Hello, welcome to Biblical Perspective Season 3. And in this season, we are going to be studying the book in the Bible that is referred to as the book of Ephesians. I am once again joined by my good friend, Frank Hasel, and we are glad to have these next few minutes with you to study. And Frank, you read through the book of Ephesians. What would you say right off the bat is your first impression of Ephesians as we go into this study?
Well, first impression, it's a wonderful book. If you want to read it through, it takes about 15, 20 minutes. And I would highly recommend doing that. Just taking 15, 20 minutes and read the whole book in one stretch. I found it inspiring. It's focusing on Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
It speaks to some issues that are relevant to our lives as Christians, as His followers. And there is a lot of hope and encouragement to be found in that book.
I like what you said about read it once through, just as an overview, 15 minutes, 15 minutes of your day. You can do that. Wake up in the morning,
Exactly.
read 15 minutes and have it. It's kind of good before we dig in deep to have that broader overview. There's this kind of this concept of, I know that there's this preacher that I really admire. His name was HMS Richards back in the day, and he would say how he'd read through the entire Bible in January, get an airplane view, and then the rest of the year he would then dig into it more deeply. But that airplane view would help him as he read more deeply, connect the various points within the Bible. It'd be the same for Ephesians.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you keep in mind that these letters actually were intended to be read to the churches.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't just read a couple verses and stop there. They would read the entire letter. And I think that's a good experience because it gives you that overview that you mentioned. You don't get lost by looking at the trees and some details, but you see the entire picture that he wants to convey.
Maybe to keep focus, it might even be good then, Frank, to read out loud, right?
Yeah,
So,
that's right.
Because they were meant to be read and to be heard. We forget that sometimes about the Bible, that the majority of the Bible was primarily heard rather than read by most people.
And it does make a difference if you read it loud. I mean, read it silently, but read it loud as well, yeah.
Yeah, it's good. So before we get into the meat of Ephesians, let's talk a little bit about the history of this book. First of all, we believe that this book was written by the Apostle Paul. There's evidence within the book that shows that it was the Apostle Paul, even, of course, him saying the very first verse, which says, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the will of God.
Yes. So that's a strong indicator. He also makes reference to his being imprisonment.
Yep.
And so we have every reason to believe that this really was written by Paul himself.
Now, Paul didn't write the most words in the New Testament. That is actually probably Luke in the book of Luke and the book of Acts. But Paul did write the most individual letters or books. And, and his letters seem to be to groups of people or individuals. You have the groups of people like the people in Corinth, the people in Ephesus, as we're going to look at, the people in Galatia, various other places. Then he had, of course, his individual books to like Titus and Timothy and Philemon that we see also. So Paul wrote to either groups or individuals. This is to a group of people. And Paul's writing to this group of people because he has a relationship. And let's look at some of that relationship.
Absolutely.
Let's go back to the book of Acts, actually, which we just mentioned, that was written by Luke. This is the first reference to Paul's connection to Ephesus or the Ephesians. Will you read 18 through 21?
Yes, Acts 18, verse 18 and following. After this, Paul stayed many days longer and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. At Canche he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow, and they came to Ephesus. And he left them there, but he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And when they asked him to stay for a longer period, he declined. But on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills. And he set sail from Ephesus.
we see he had a quick visit here. This is the end of what would be referred to as Paul's second missionary journey. I just want to tell our friends that are watching this in the United States that Paul didn't cut his hair because he was wowed, but because of a vow. My German brother, his V is a W, right?
That's right. Thank you.
Yes. But I double checked on that. I was like, he cut his hair because he was wowed.
Thank you, Chad.
So here he has a quick visit, but then he has a longer visit, and let's look at that in Acts chapter 19. And it happened that while Apollos was at Corinth, Paul passed through the inland country and came to Ephesus. There he found some disciples. So in other words, there were some people that had been converted somehow when he was on his first trip, which was very short, and now he's in his second trip to Ephesus. And the Bible tells us in Ephesus, or in Acts chapter 19, that he stayed there this time for 3 years. So sometimes when we read about these journeys, we can think that, like, because the way the lineup goes, it seems like it's all very compressed. And because, there's only one really chapter about Paul in Ephesus in the book of Acts. And yet this one chapter, 3 years of things happened.
And that's so significant, I think, Chad, because sometimes we think of Paul as the person who initiates and establishes churches and baptizes believers and then moves on. But here he sees the need to actually come back and to ground them in the faith, to spend time with them. I mean, 3 years is not just a weekend.
Yeah. No, it is a significant amount of time, especially for the context there of being on a missionary journey, and yet when he gets there, he realizes, you know what? I need to stay here a little bit longer. That conviction came.
And it tells you something about his dedication.
Yeah.
I mean, he sees this is needed, and I'm willing to invest that much time and energy in order to build them up and make them stronger in the faith.
Now, there's a couple of incidents that happen when Paul's there in his 3 years that are recorded in the book of Acts that give us some insight into Ephesus. Now, before we reference that, I would like to say, just as we think about Ephesus, just so people have some understanding, it was one of the largest cities in the Roman Empire. Historians.
It was.
It's not anymore, obviously. But
have you ever been? Have you ever had?
No, I never been to Ephesus.
I had a chance to visit Ephesus and the ruins there.
Yeah.
And it is impressive.
Is it?
I mean, you go there and you don't just have the amphitheater. You had a huge library there.
Yeah.
You had elaborate constructions and buildings. They had comforts and a level of sophistication that you would not find hundreds of years only later.
Wow.
So they had running water. They had heating in the floor.
Wow.
They had all kinds of sophisticated architecture, and of course they had the huge temple there.
Yep.
This temple was
to Artemis or Diana.
Yes, and this was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world.
Yeah.
I mean, this was huge. You stand there, even seeing just the ruins of it, and you feel small.
Really?
Looking at these pillars and things. So it's kind of on a hilly side, and then descends down to the sea level. Actually, today, you don't see the ocean anymore. The ocean has receded several kilometers. But at that time, you would have the harbor there, and the amphitheater was right at the level there. And it's just it was a major city.
It's good that you mentioned that the sea has receded because it was known as a harbor city. And if you went there, or if you looked on it on a map right now, someone would go, wait, they're lying. It's not a harbor city.
Yes.
The sea has receded. There's climate change, right? And the sea has receded away from it and has moved, and so it's no longer that that port city that it once was. But it was a port city. It was also in a prime location for travelers as they passed by. You mentioned the temple. The temple was key because there was a lot of, we could say, tourist activity in the sense of, people would come and buy various things. There's actually a riot in Ephesus related to Paul because of that. People were no longer buying the souvenirs, quote unquote, from the temple. So it was.
You find other rather interesting, not little details, but things. For instance, just a little outside of the city, you find the remains of a baptistry.
Okay.
Where people got baptized in the ancient church.
Yeah.
And if you look at these baptistries, they are not just a little container where you would pour some water on the head of the little infant. You would have to step into that and be baptized by immersion. And that's how they were baptized in the ancient days, in the biblical times.
So it affirms the idea of baptism by immersion, which is good.
Exactly, yes.
Now, you mentioned that there's a huge library there. And that goes to one of the historical things that I want to address because we read in the book of Acts chapter 19 that there was, God was doing these extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul, the Bible tells us. And these miracles and all these things that were happening led the people to respond in a specific way.
Well,
you can tell me, where's that at?
18, 19.
Yeah, go ahead and read that,
Yeah, talking about some of the Jewish exorcists and others. And also many of those who were now believers came, confessing and divulging their practices, their exorcists.
These were people that were spiritualists, we'd say. They were doing magic arts. They were in all these other pagan things. And now they see what Paul's doing, and they're convicted that he's working under a power that is no power they've ever seen, which is, of course, the power of God. And they're convicted, right?
And I think it's not just a matter of power. You can be intrigued by superior power.
Yeah.
But I think what really made the difference in the lives of these people is not just that they experienced superior power, but they experienced the change of heart.
Yeah.
They experienced something that shifted their direction in their life, and that made them aware who they really are and the need for Jesus Christ. And once you experience that, it gives your whole life a different direction. And then you see this amazing...
Before you get there, sorry, Frank, I'm going to interrupt you because I just looked down and I just thought to myself, verse 18 that you just read, I'm thinking about it even as you're talking, and you're talking about, it was something about the heart. It says, the believers came confessing and divulging their practices.
Yes.
We don't live in a community anymore where people feel safe to confess, do we? I mean, this is what happens when heart changes, and a willingness to say, now someone doesn't need to give their laundry list of things, but they came saying, look, this was my sin, and I'm giving it to the Lord, and the fellow believers came around them, supported them. There's this beauty there in that.
Well, in our society, you have maybe a more something that we would call coming out,
Yeah.
But it's not the same as confessing.
No, it's not.
Confessing is not just telling other people who you think you are.
Yeah.
But confessing means that you recognize that something was wrong in your life and that needs to be changed, and that you experience the freedom that comes through Jesus Christ.
The confession is there's something that is counter to who God called me to be. So I'm going to be who God called me to be.
Yes.
Yeah. So anyways, they're confessing, and then verse 19.
And a number of those who had practiced magic arts brought their books together and burned them in the sight of all. And they counted the value of them and found it came to 50,000 pieces of silver.
Read verse 20.
So the word of the Lord continued to increase and prevail mightily.
So there was this major book burning that happens. You said there's this huge library. They're a very knowledgeable place. There's this huge library that's there in Ephesus. So this would be very offensive to the people there if they've invested all this time in books and a library, and people are coming in and burning their books. Now, we're living in a society where there's been all kinds of talk right now about getting rid of books and banning books and all these things. And it's mostly people wanting to enforce this upon other people. So let's talk about that difference. As we think about Ephesus, where they have this book burning, which should be a model for us, and we'll talk about why it's a model for us. But let's talk about what it's not first. So what was it not?
Yeah, well, if we read closely what the Bible tells us here, we see one, in my opinion, significant difference to some of the book burnings that we've seen in history, even in recent history. And that is, here people are not forced to burn books. Books are not just taken out. They didn't burn the library.
Yeah.
Now, in that library, it was a huge library.
Yeah.
You can still see the remains. You had several tens of thousands of books there.
Yeah.
And they didn't burn the books, and there were not just good books in the library, so to speak, But so what they did something that they felt convicted God called them to get rid of in their lives, that kind of had a spell over them, had led them into bondage to some of these magic things that they had practiced earlier. So that's something completely different from some of the book burning. Let's say we've seen the Nazis do in the 1930s.
Talk about that. Give kind of expand on that, because I know there's a story that, even a quote that you shared with me off camera, that I think is appropriate for this.
Yes, there's a famous German author and poet and philosopher. His name is Heinrich Heine, and has written many books and poems in German, wonderful pieces. And he already in the 19th century made this famous statement that says, where they burn books, they will in the end burn people.
And he said this like in the 1930s, right? Or
no, he said this in the 19th century.
Oh, okay.
1800s.
I mean, the 1800s, yeah.
He wrote a theater piece, and in that piece he was talking about burning the Quran through the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah.
And they did this centuries earlier. The irony of this is that in the 1930s, while he was still alive, the Nazis burned his books publicly in Berlin, along with many other famous German authors that they felt were not Aryan enough and supportive of their Nazi philosophy. And of course, we know the tragic history that the Nazis also burned people. So his prediction, so to speak, came true. And that is what we often see. It's not just the contempt that they have towards the literature, but also towards the people who write the literature or identify with that literature.
So when someone's reading about the history of Ephesus and they say, oh, there was a book burning, and they're like, yeah, we need to ban books. We need to get rid of books. This is not about you as a Christian going and saying, I'm going into my pagan neighbor's library and I'm going to take out their books and burn them as a sign of...
I think we don't have the right to do that, and we should not do that, and we should respect other people and their convictions, even though we are convinced that this might be wrong or is wrong. So we are not called to burn anyone or any books for that matter. And this is not the case here in Acts 19. This was not... a mandatory burning of books that they thought are not acceptable, but they voluntarily brought things that they felt would hinder their pursuit of being a child of God and to acknowledge Jesus Christ as their only and Lord in their life and Savior.
So Frank, so we would affirm that practice, that you bring your own stuff in your life that gets in the way of your walk with Jesus.
See, I think there's some truth and there's wisdom in that also, because if you realize that there is something in your life that keeps you from following Jesus, that leads you into bondage to dark powers, evil spirits, and you have practiced that, and you realize, man, Jesus set me free. why do you want to continue to have an influence of things in your life that leads you away from Jesus and that distracts you from following him wholeheartedly?
Has there ever been anything in your life, Frank, that you've gotten rid of that was that you've burned?
Actually, I have not burned anything in my life, but I know a story from my father, who was a pastor in Germany and who met a woman who was deeply involved in occult practices and devil spirit worship, and she had some of these books. And when she experienced the love of God and the freedom that Jesus Christ gave her in her life, she felt that she could no longer, as a committed Christian, possess those books that were dedicated to the devil and that introduced you to the secret magic that was practiced there to heal people and to predict some things, etc. And she brought all these books to my father and said, please burn those books. Mm. And he did. And I didn't burn any books, but I realized, everyone is different and has different challenges and different temptations. And at one point, I realized that there's some things in my life that, as nice as they might look and sound, are keeping me, don't bring me closer to Christ, but point in a different direction. And so for me, at one point, this confession time. So I liked jazz music very much, and I like to listen to that. And I realized that if I listen to that kind of music, it has a certain impact on my thinking, on the mood, on this, the way I look at things, and I got convinced that this is not helping me getting closer to Jesus Christ. And so I tried to get rid of some of that.
And I think you just said something there good, and we're a little bit on a tangent here, but that's okay because I do that. Not everything is, as Paul says in another place, not everything's bad, but it's not the best, right? So there's things that are permissible, but are they what's best, right?
Yeah.
And I think, you mentioned jazz. Someone may go, jazz, that doesn't seem like a big thing. But you said a key thing there. Anything that's an impediment to like me growing, even if it's maybe seems to be a good thing in some ways, if it's an impediment to my walk with the Lord. I've never burned anything either, but I have done. When I first became a follower of Jesus, I used to listen to a lot of rap. I had groups like Public Enemy and Naughty by Nature, all these groups. You may not know them, but some people out there know what I'm talking about. And I got this big black trash bag, and I took all these CDs and threw them out. One time I dated a non-Adventist young lady, and I realized that this was inconsistent with where I wanted to go. So I broke up with her. I didn't throw her out, but we broke up. She understood. And then I think also just recently, Frank, I've completely left social media. Now you use social media well and nicely, but for me, it just made me angry, and I was spending so much time on it. So I completely, so these are...
I understand.
These are the things that I think that all of us have things like the Ephesus folk. They had a conviction of their heart, and they realized these things were part of their old life that they were confessing, and they were saying, there's no reason to hold on to those things in my old life. And I think sometimes we in our lives, whether it be a relationship that's not healthy, whether it be an aspect of entertainment that's not healthy, whatever it may be, we need to be willing to say, you know what, I need to bring this and give it to God. And that's our metaphorical burning, so to speak.
Yes, and I think that's the beauty of being a child of God, because God leads everyone a little different, and he points out, because he has created us differently with different talents and gifts, and yet everyone has different challenges as well, and he sees that, and so he leads you to get rid of something that might not be a problem for me.
Yeah.
And vice versa.
Exactly. This reminds me of the text in the book of Hebrews, which we studied a couple years ago, Frank, together, where Paul says, let us set aside every hindrance, everything that entangles us.
Yes.
And so it's that type of thing. Now, back to Ephesians, though. The reason why I even bring this up about this book burning thing is I think of Ephesians chapter 1 and verses 9 and 10. Well, actually, I want to start in verse 7. It's talking about Jesus, and it says, "In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses according to the riches of his grace, which he lavished upon us in all wisdom and insight." Paul uses very flowery language in this, very expressive. He lavished upon us in all wisdom and insight, making known to us the mystery of his will. I think maybe one of these episodes, Frank, we will talk about the mystery, because the word mystery is mentioned a lot.
Reoccurs several times.
Yes. According to his purpose, which he set forth in Christ. And then this verse, as a plan for the fullness of time to unite all things in him, things in heaven and things on earth. This book, and Paul is writing this, he's telling us, because of what Jesus has done for us through the blood, I want everything I'm writing you so that you'll unite your entire life, that your church, that your home, that your family, we're going to talk about some family things in this book, that all of it, that your theology, that everything will be united under
your lifestyle,
your lifestyle. Everything will be united under Christ. And we see in this episode of this book burning, this picture of these people saying, we want to be united under Christ. We want our hearts to be united with Christ. We want to get rid of these things.
Yes.
And you see that in that theme of that, or in that story, I think illustrates what Paul is trying to accomplish in this verse that we read about.
Yes, I fully agree. And for that reason, this cannot and never function as an example to burn just anything that I don't like with other people.
Exactly.
It's an individual, personal decision that a person voluntarily makes, not being forced, not being told. But
from the conviction of their heart with Jesus.
Yes.
This is what I'm doing to unite with where Jesus.
And if you were to keep these things that you know full well will lead me away from Jesus Christ, it will not be healthy for you and your spiritual life.
Now, let's real quick go to one other thing about the history. Well, actually, I want to go first to Acts chapter 20 and verse 31. Will you go back to Acts chapter 20 and verse 31 and read that? Because it sets up the last thing I want to say about the church in Ephesus. Acts chapter 20 and verse 31.
Therefore, be alert, remembering that for 3 years I did not cease night or day to admonish everyone with tears.
Paul says admonish there, but the New King James Version says warn. Even though Paul, this is a very warm letter that he writes to the Ephesians later on, which he's writing and stuff, Paul warns them because you can throw out everything, right? You can get rid of your CDs like I did. You can get rid of jazz music. You can burn the books that are not in accordance with God. And what we see in the history of the Ephesian church is that you can do all the right things and still drift away from what is most important. And for that, I point out to us Revelation chapter 2, in which now John the Revelator here is writing to the church in Ephesus, the same church that Paul worked in for 3 years and had this great relationship with. Now, in Revelation chapter 2, John is writing to them years later, and he says, I know your works, your toil, and your patient endurance, and how you cannot bear with those who are evil, but have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not, and found them to be false. So they're still staying committed to living truth, right? This is who they are. I knew you are enduring patiently and bearing up for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary. They're living in this city in which is a very pagan city, the Temple of Diana, Temple of Artemis, 7 wonders of the world. They're still staying strong, not growing weary. But I have this against you, he says, that you have abandoned the love that you had at first. You have lost your first love.
Yeah. And
Go ahead.
And here's something else that I think is beautiful and important at the same time, and tells us something about Paul and the kind of person he was. When we hear the word admonish, or warn, we usually have something in mind that points the finger at something that is not right, and there's a human tendency in all of us, I think. We quickly perceive what is wrong with other people rather than with ourselves, and we'd like to point that out, and sometimes as Christians we even feel we have the responsibility to do that, whereas actually John tells us, or Jesus tells us in the Gospel of John, that this is the work of the Holy Spirit. And sometimes we try to attempt to correct people and trying to do the work that only the Holy Spirit can do. But here you see that he admonishes with tears. Now you cannot, if you do that, you admonish, you correct, you warn differently. If you're so touched by what you see, if you're moved to the point that you have to cry, because it pains you, because you love the person, because that person is valuable to you, you will talk very differently to the person than just pointing out, this is wrong, that is wrong, why don't you change this and this? If you have that mentality, you will not receive the response that Paul receives just a couple verses later in the same chapter, chapter 20, when they knelt down and prayed with them, and there was much weeping on the part of all, and they embraced Paul and kissed him. You do that only if you see
that someone loves you.
That someone loves you, and that you resonate with that person, that you see that whatever he or she has said to you was not done out of a feeling of superiority or condemnation, but because I'm concerned and I want you to live well, and I want you to be right with Jesus. And so if we could have and emulate that kind of spirit in our interactions, I think life in our churches and in our homes and in our families would be
much more peaceful. Yeah, you're right. I think it's a great place to end as we look at this history of Ephesus. That this church that Paul loved dearly, that he was guiding them, that he was warning them, and yet even I would say within ourselves. Like you said, we're quick to look at others, but the warning to me about Ephesus is so much good, and yet still you can drift away from Christ. And as we look through the book of Ephesians, one of the things we'll see over and over again is Paul's emphasis on Christ and not forgetting that first love. And so as we read the book of Ephesians, I hope it'll stir up in people again their first love. Not their temptation to look at others and say, how are they parenting, or how are they being with their wife, or how are they doing this or whatever, but that it'll stir up in them a desire to say, I want to be fully united to Jesus. And hear the tearful admonishments of Paul.
Amen.
And love of Paul and be convicted in this book.
Yes.
We thank you so much for joining us in this first episode. We look forward to talking about more from the book of Ephesians in future episodes. Every week we have a new episode, and so we hope that you'll join us then. God bless you. Have a good day.